Hello, I'm Stephen Robinson, or the Play Typer guy, as my son calls me. Today, I'm excited to have with me Kaivan Shroff, who is a Democratic political commentator who's worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign in the past. We can get into some other exciting things you're doing a little bit later, because I'd want to ask you about that. But first off, thank you for coming in, for joining us today.
Great to join.
And the timing is perfect for our conversation because last night, from when we're recording, was the New Hampshire primary where Donald Trump defeated Nikki Haley and became, I believe, the first Republican candidate since 1976 to win both Iowa and New Hampshire in a contested primary. So, if you could just give us your take, Kavan, on what happened and on what would have been, many pundits thought, Nikki Haley's best chance to make some sort of change in the momentum.
Sure. I think the way you frame that is so perfect because it was really pundits who were driving, I think, the Nikki Haley narrative. Sure, she's 11 points behind Trump. A week ago, it was that she was tied with Trump. Then it was that she could beat Trump. And now they're trying to cast this, second place in a two-person race as that she did something amazing and won something. I mean, she lost. She was going to lose. This primary has been over since the day it began. This race has been clearly a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump since, it's been on anyone's radar. And yet, if you were following the news, and I find this to be a problem for our democracy, if you've been following the news closer than the average American, you're more likely, I think, to have thought that either Biden had a chance of not being the nominee or Trump had the chance of not being a nominee. And that's because so much goes into the horse race, week to week coverage, who's up and down in the polls, who has quote unquote momentum. If you remember, they were saying that Nikki Haley was surging, using the word surge, when she was moving from low single digits to low double digits. I mean, sure, is that an increase directionally? It is. Does it mean she has a chance to be the nominee? Absolutely not. So that really was my top line takeaway.
Yeah, and the horse race argument is so perfect, and I think it's something that keeps coming up. Even like back in 2016, and you'd worked on the Clinton campaign. There'd be this sense of, maybe it's over because Bernie Sanders has done well in this caucus race and in this area, and then it would move to a primary where Hillary Clinton's base support is, and then she would dominate. So it's sort of like, well, as you certain, you don't want to say that looking at demographics or turnout, a race is over sometimes, but then it's kind of like, well, that's kind of how it is sometimes. It's like, it's not that, oh my God, she lost a caucus race by predominantly white college students that were always Sanders, so similar to like last night. This was her best demo. And if you actually dug down in the numbers, like Trump won Republicans, self-identified Republicans, by more than 50 points. They're going to her home state of South Carolina, my home state as well, where she is
30
it's
points.
30 points down, but it's like more white evangelicals are in South Carolina than in Iowa. It is a far harsher landscape, but the surge narrative actually makes it seem as if like an entirely different group is somehow going to influence, South Carolina voters. And it's like, oh no, it's a month. A month is an eternity in politics. It's like, oh, so what could happen in that month? We could find out that Donald Trump is a, confirmed rapist who's on trial for 91 felony counts. Like I think we kind of what could possibly occur.
Well, let's be
Kaivan.
honest, because I feel like we're not allowed to say this. There's one thing that could happen in that month that would lead to Nikki Haley being the nominee, and only one thing, and I'll leave it at that. But
I will actually be bold enough to say, because people have been framing this, but to me, I really want your thoughts on this, because to me it just seems like there are so many wolves at the door who made the choice that Haley and Ron DeSantis did not make, which is, we're not getting in this mess. We're holding our fire. Like Ted Cruz came in second, most Republican in 2020, most Republican 2016, most Republican second place finishers do come back. He didn't come back. Josh Hawley, a lot of folks who Tom Cotton like was thinking about it but didn't, and it felt like to me, if you got this sort of crazy West Wing scenario, what you would get at a brokered convention would be a full-on MAGA catastrophe. Like all
Sure.
of these folks would come in and say, "Well, I'm the one who could win, not I'm the true heir to Trump, not Nikki Haley." And anyone close to Trump would, of course, enable that. So this idea that she could kind of, as a distant second, then win if something would happen to him, also seems very unrealistic to sort of reality.
Right. I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, that's true. But you look at Nikki Haley, she's been framed as a moderate or some reasonable person. I mean, she herself says, I'm no moderate. She is no moderate.
Mm,
She passed a federal abortion ban. She has defended Trump on every issue. She claims that, she was attacking Ron DeSantis, that how you run your campaign reflects how you lead. And then the next day was asked about, all Trump's legal issues. And she said she doesn't pay attention to them. That makes no sense. If you're running for the nomination and the guy beating you has several legal issues hanging over his head, you should be paying attention to them. He's lying, so it's not true. But
yeah.
I do think that what Nikki Haley shows is, and I think this is undercounted. It was undercounted for Hillary. It's undercounted for Haley, and a little bit for Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a different creature that we can talk about. But I do think, fundamentally, the country has a racism and sexism problem, and the Republican Party really has a racism and sexism problem. And so it's no surprise that as the narrative came that, Haley's gaining on Trump or getting closer, he did bring out the birtherism 2.0 attack. He did start making fun of her name. And I think that resonates with this group of voters. We saw that in Iowa when Trump said that immigrants poison the blood of the country. That actually led to a response from those voters, those Iowa GOP caucus voters, that they were more likely to support Trump. So they're fully in that basket of deplorables, and it's time for us to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I would like to, if I may, because when Trump did the birther argument and it was absurd, like the idea that she wasn't eligible because her parents were immigrants. Yeah, there's no legal basis, even what he said. That's not the point. But what was interesting was that he got what he wanted. There was like all these articles that had young Nikki Haley with her parents who are, and I think this is wonderful because you're Indian yourself. You've talked about a lot of these issues in ways that I feel like a lot of our punditry is not qualified to talk about. And you've actually gone to this point. But to me, it was sort of, and I've been reflexively defensive of her in certain ways because I didn't like how people on the left and right have gone after about her name or putting white on her birth
Sure.
certificate and all of that. But you are sort of in that position to sort of, you've called it out. And I know I would love to hear more about that, because when Trump went on the birtherism, the first thing we saw was all these articles of young Nikki Haley. And again, let's be blunt about this. Nikki Haley presents as white in certain ways culturally. Her parents are look Indian, right? Like he was, the certain cultural signifiers. And that's what you're saying. That's what Trump wanted. Like he got on the news that image, and I was seeing a lot of MAGA were sort of spreading those photos and then saying terrible things about her in ways they hadn't before. And so, yeah, please go on about your thoughts about.
Sure. I mean, so no apology needed at all. I'm glad to have the conversation, and thanks for having me on. I think what stands out to me, so I absolutely agree with you, because I know you and I talked about that we do see these liberals sort of in our comments in response to our content, calling her Nimrata, trying to use her birth name on her first birth name on her birth certificate to kind of point out the fact that she has sort of changed her name, doesn't identify by the name on her birth certificate. And I think it is sort of an unfair attack if you just take it in the context of, well, other candidates have changed their names. Mitt Romney, his first name's not Mitt. You have a lot of nicknames in politics for sure, Bobby, all that type of stuff. But I think what stands out to me as an Indian American who's followed Haley for a long time, just because of that angle, is that she's doing two things at once. For me, I'm progressive. I'm all for people choosing how they want to identify, even though someone like Haley would refuse to acknowledge how somebody, chooses to identify with their pronouns and all that stuff. So there's a little bit of an irony there. But I will say it's the two functions at once of her choosing to opt in to dominant white Christian American identities while also denying and gaslighting about the realities of racism and the history in this country. So, yes, I think if you say Nikki Haley goes by the middle name on her birth certificate instead of her more ethnic sounding first name, maybe it's a little problematic to really focus on that alone. Then you take, though, that she also did identify as white on her 2001 voter registration card. It's a weird thing to do, by the way, because there's been some blurring of the lines here. There's been a lie put out that the only options were white, black, or, other. And that's not true. At the time, Asian would have been a category she could have selected. And by the way, she could have selected other. So it's not true. So she chose to identify as white instead of Asian, which she is. It doesn't make sense. And then third, she did convert to Christianity instead of, her religion is Sikhism. And again, each of those things taken separately, I think it's fair to wonder why somebody would point that out. But when you look at that pattern of consistently opting in to a more privileged group, and when she is of a skin tone where she can pass as white, I think, by the way, it's not just the circulation of that photo that you're talking about that I think was Trump's goal. I do think genuinely many people, even many well-meaning people who don't have anything against her, don't know that she is an Indian American woman.
Mm-hmm.
They think she is white because she has portrayed herself that way in every instance she had the opportunity to do so, until at 50 plus she launched her incredibly cynical presidential campaign saying, I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm different. And then she upholds all these model and minority tropes. Regardless, it's that behavior in conjunction with what we've seen in recent weeks, but it's really her life career, which is that she's denied that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. She used to say that America is not racist. Now she says it was never racist. So you're to ask, well, why then? Whether it was you that decided not to go by your more ethnic sounding first name, or your family that was in the South decades ago in the 70s raising a young Indian girl and decided to call you by Nikki, the middle name on your birth certificate, that happened for a reason. And it's a reason a lot of immigrant communities understand, Indian American or otherwise, which is assimilation. And so to deny the realities that all of those choices were made because there was discrimination, which she now acknowledges, by the way, that she was discriminated against as a child trying to compete in a beauty pageant because they didn't know whether to count her as black or white. She says she faced discrimination all the time. So which is it, Nikki Haley? And stop lying that it doesn't exist. I think that's the point. And that's why
Absolutely.
it's ask, why does she go by the name Nikki? I'm not going to call her a name that she doesn't go by, but I think it is fair to ask about the evolution of how we got there.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for putting that so well. And her story definitely, I think, from a sort of a moral and political standpoint, her choices have not made sense, because the tap dance, or the sort of trying to like play both sides of that argument, has not worked, because Fox News has been hammering her, saying she sounds like a woke liberal for just even acknowledging that she had been, bullied as a child, because of her skin tone. Matt Walsh, who's at the Daily Wire, a far right commentator there, was like, she doesn't even look that brown. I would have even known, and sort of that a lot of that BS. And then from, as I said before, my family's from South Carolina. I grew up in South Carolina. Longtime Democrats, as one might expect. They did not vote for Nikki Haley. No one in my family voted for Nikki Haley, though she had a degree of goodwill as a Republican governor. It was like, we didn't vote for you, but we think you're doing a decent enough job, right? Whatever. She has systematically burned that, and deliberately, right? Like, she has attacked Barack Obama relentlessly. She, in ways, also saying that he made race relations worse, which is one of those
and that Trump made them better.
Very triggering comments that you don't, as we joke, in Black households, there's photos of Martin Luther King and the Michelle Obama's husband next to Michelle Obama, but he's very well loved amongst Black South Carolinians, and excluding Tim Scott, I'm sure. So then she also has made this election, instead of attacking Trump, she has relentlessly attacked Kamala Harris, with whom she shares a heritage, the first woman, first Indiana, first Black vice president, relentlessly attacked her as somehow not just, let's say, a Democratic version of Dan Quayle, which I think would be unfair, but has attacked her as so incompetent or so dangerous, even though her politics are necessarily not that different from Joe Biden's, but so dangerous that, well, I've got to support Trump because the chance of President Harris is so horrible. So she's basically already written Joe Biden off as dead, and then says that Kamala is like, so it should make everyone scared and terrified. And again, as you were saying, a very cynical, like, why do you think people in Wisconsin or elsewhere in the Rust Belt would be scared of President Kamala Harris? What policies, or what is it about her? How is she reckless on foreign policy, particularly compared to let Ukraine fend for itself and let's pull out of NATO, Donald Trump? Like, she can't spin. She's doing a very calculated attack that, again, people I know in South Carolina see and see it for what it is. So she's burned a lot of goodwill. Like, I've seen, again, pundits, predominantly white pundits, suggesting, oh, well, every Democrat, because it's not a real primary down there for Democrats, so Biden is going to win. So every Democrat should register as a Republican and support Haley to stop Trump. And it's like, no, because Joe Biden's very popular amongst Black voters. And also, no, none of my relatives is going to pull a ballot for Nikki Haley after what she has said. Like, after what she said about racism and about the set, like, that just seems absurd to me. Like, no one's paid attention to these voters.
Well, and it's just such an indictment of the pundit class, which are mostly white and mostly male, I'll also add. And then also this sort of like quote unquote moderate Wall Street, Jamie Dimon group of people who think that Reid Hoffman, who are these, maybe they gave some money to liberals in the past so they don't think they're racist. But the reality is Nikki Haley has towed the MAGA line at every step. She fully embraced MAGA. She called for the deportation of US-born African-American Senator Raphael Warnock in November of 2022. That wasn't too long ago. That was months before she launched her presidential campaign. Incredibly racist. And so they didn't embrace her back. So she had to come up with plan B. That's the reality. She couldn't win over the MAGA base. She tried her darndest. She defended Trump on race. She pulled us out of the UN Human Rights Council. She's done all these horrible things, and she is no moderate in any way. She's pro-forced birth. So I think, these people that like that she presents a little bit less hostile, I mean, it's so ridiculous and offensive, I think. They haven't been paying any attention. And the choice between Nikki Haley and Joe Biden is night and day. It's similar to the choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We just know more about Trump because he's always on, the front page of the news. But Nikki Haley doesn't stand for one thing. She will change her mind based on any poll, based on anything. So imagine she becomes the Republican nominee. Or imagine she, God forbid, becomes the president. She'll be doing what her donors and voters tell her. And her donors and voters are a bunch of racists. Let's be clear. I mean, duh. So absolutely terrible. Then I think number two, you have to ask, Nikki Haley has boxed herself in, right? I mean, now she's getting the sexist attacks as well. She's getting the racist attacks. Trump was talking about her dress at the New Hampshire victory speech. And what can she say? Because she's held herself up as this prop to be a shield, human shield for the Republican Party to deny charges of racism and sexism. So she can't turn around and say these attacks are racist and sexist. So it's a horrible strategy.
Yeah, when I wrote about this a while back on my Substack, I had mentioned how she it it was like the Veep TV show, where the idea that she's clueless enough to not be aware of the legal problems. It's like it would have been, you would imagine Julie Louis-Dreyfus being like, "What? Why didn't you tell me? I was talking about the debt I lost to a rapist. Like, why did you mention?" But the idea that she's that clueless, whereas she had been aware of, prominent Republican primary opponent Don Lemon basically making an offensive comment. She pounced on, had swag, talking about all of this, and yet is unaware, is oblivious, has backed down against constantly, even worse, as you said, sexist attacks from Trump. and she could only hit Trump in ways, again, that both sort of kind of like, oh well, when Trump had his, rambling fascist speech and was sexist and racist and awful, he's kind of like Joe Biden. They're both old and confused. It's like, well, Biden doesn't, even if you were to concede, well, you don't have to concede it. Yes, he's older than Trump. He's 80. But even if you can see that he's lost a step, he's not a driveling racist. Like, he doesn't get confused and starts into Mein Kampf rants. That's Trump, and that's always been Trump, by the way. That has nothing to do with his age. He's like back with the Central Park Five, back with not discriminate against black renters in New York. So as you said, she's constantly back down on those areas, show nothing but cowardice. And to go back to what she was saying, South Carolina, that this sort of tension is wonderful that we can have this discussion, because there's always that tension of, we talk about America as a racist country. It's also overtly anti-black. So certain ways, a lot of immigrants, especially immigrants of color, have been boxed into that sense of to advance means to embrace a degree of anti-blackness. That is how. And so she, in her story, definitely concedes to that. So when she talks about, and again, I wrote for this on my Substack, of how she talked about, well, when you tell people there's not a race, that America's a racist country, you're telling them to fail. I'm so glad my parents didn't tell me that. And I think of like, well, the insult that is to black parents who they are preparing their kids for race. So there's no, it's not telling them to like, oh, play the victim or whatever. It is, if you think of Emmett Till, when he was, wanting to visit a relative in the Jim Crow South, the Deep South, he was warned about rules of behavior that if he crossed even the slightest line, he would get killed. That's not saying, oh, Emmett, be a victim and the world is up against you. It was not like saying, hey, hold your head up high and and say hello to any white woman who comes near you, and that will be the no. It's like, this is how you have to follow these worlds. It's a police state or you will die. And when she does not acknowledge that is such the tension between, as you say, the model minorities who become part of that trap, and for kind of promoting anti-blackness, that the anti-blackness that we experience is somehow our fault, which is so twisted, right? Like, and simply,
and I think it's sort of that absolutely is the case. But I think one thing you mentioned is really, I see predominant as well in the Indian American community, predominant, but not, the main theme, just so people know, because people ask me this all the time. Indian Americans, I think about 80% expressed support for the Clinton Kaine ticket in 2016, and something around like 70% plus or minus 5. I don't have that number off the top of my head. It supported the Biden Harris ticket. So they do lean Democrat. But there is this idea that by somehow identifying as a Republican, I think we're seeing this more and more among like the Latino community in certain areas as well. That you somehow arrived and you now belong to this like class, and like you're whiter and you're richer, and it's like none of those things are true, and they're going to turn on you in a minute. We saw that with Tim Scott when he spoke about the racism's curriculum in Florida, and DeSantis immediately attacked him. Same with Byron Donald, spoke up, said there aren't silver linings. Immediately he was, a Republican in name only. So we've seen that again and again. But what I will say is that Nikki Haley and other Republicans are so skilled, although it doesn't take that much skill, so I don't want to say so skilled. They are able to exploit this setup that the media and I think liberals themselves have created, where there is such a double standard. So, for example, I did want to call out Nikki Haley for going by not the first name on her birth certificate, because I think it's relevant for the reasons that we just discussed in a larger context. But you know who did that first? Was actually not first ever, maybe, but Sunny Hostin on The View pointed out that Nikki Haley is somebody who passes and who leans in and out of identity when it's convenient. And what did Nikki Haley do? She immediately called Sunny racist for pointing out her name. And then what did I think that did? I think that shut down the conversation very effectively, because no white male pundit's going to talk about it ever again. No, the media is famously not diverse. So unless you are an Indian American, and by the way, even myself, I've struggled to talk about this issue. I've written a million op-eds about it. I tweeted out that thread. It did go kind of viral. I tweeted it out, to be honest. I submitted that to a lot of outlets that take my op-eds, but they weren't comfortable because they're so scared of that Republican backlash. And the reality is, we saw this, not to go on a little bit of a tangent, but with the Harvard plagiarism case and Claudine Gay, right? This idea that the most unscrupulous, corrupt people on the planet, Chris Rufo, a white supremacist Republican operative from Florida, is going to attack her for, poorly attributed citations from decades ago, that she didn't pass along, any work is plagiarized, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, you turn around and we don't want to hold Bill Ackman's wife accountable. We don't want to hold any of these other people accountable. Alan Dershowitz, the list goes on of people who did the same exact thing. So, but of course, she resigned. The liberals caved. The academia caved. Like, these institutions cave and they fall over themselves. But other people are never held to the same standards, the bad actors who are cynically engaging in this process.
And you talked about people of color, across the diaspora, becoming Republicans, and not everyone's a monolith. That we get, like, and I disagree certainly with certain politics regarding economic policy and so forth. But there was this period, specifically post 2000. I think George W. Bush made a real push for that, for diversity in certain ways, and a diverse cabinet, and sort of, okay, I disagree with invading other countries. I disagree with, tax cuts for the rich or whatever, but it was in a way that was somewhat race neutral, at least on a superficial level. And Haley is of that world view that has been defeated. Like, most folks from that worldview of those Republicans who believed, like, oh, I could be a Republican and just support these kind of specific policy issues, and we're not going to be a racist party anymore. Most of them saw the writing on the wall with Trump and MAGA, right? So you had from Michael Steele, Condoleezza Rice, and there are varying degrees in which these folks have either supported Democrats or most, at least, but at least most of them have been overtly anti-Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Nikki Haley sort of made her choice. So 2016, if we could go back to that, if we could, that seemed like a good exit ramp for her, right? So 2016, she endorses Rubio. And I remember Rubio, Tim Scott, they were at a rally before the South Carolina primary. And she's talking about how the three of them, she took a selfie, and she, I think, shared on social media of, like, it's like a United Colors of Bennington ad. Of course, MAGA was like, the idea, and it, to me, I looked at that and saw it as like, oh my God, she is clueless to what this insurgency is that's happening right now. And she sends this out and it's like, we're the future of the Republican Party. Isn't that awesome? It's like, well, yeah, the Bush era, like, you're in a room of just, Bush type people and donors, and they're like, oh yeah, sure, we would love a superficially diverse, make it look like a CW show when you're cutting my taxes. I don't mind. And queer people as well. That's more the merrier. Cut my taxes and invade countries. I'm all for that. But but the growing Fox News, alt right wing, that cancer that had been growing, of course, the immediate backlash to that, it was like she was just sort of advocating to them a sort of great replacement theory. We are the future. We are going to be in charge. And clearly that wasn't what the case was. And so instead, though, it felt like she's had that exit ramp to say, yeah, this is not the party I want to be involved with. And I think what happened, and granted, until January 6th, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger had made the same choice. It's like, okay, we can control Trump and get our policies. And then, but the final exit ramp would have been January 6th. And she almost took it. She criticized Trump, but then she still went groveling back. And what interpretation is that other than cravenness? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Right, there isn't one. And I think, you mentioned her comparing herself to Kamala Harris before. I think she's done the biggest favor for Vice President Harris in trying to do that. By the way, similar to Dean Phillips, actually, because what is a better example of the actual representation, genuine representation and lived experience and leadership that Kamala Harris, as somebody who is a Black woman, maybe perceived as a Black woman first, but very connected to her South Asian upbringing and has met those people, listened to them, understands them, honors them as a leader, versus Nikki Haley, who exploits her identity when convenient, but when in power has done everything she can to suppress and attack women and people of color. So it's a great opportunity to point out the difference between that sort of authentic value of diversity and representation versus just ticking a box. And it's again ironic because it's Republicans that claim that's what's happening when we do elevate diverse voices who are incredibly qualified and deserving, because that's how they engage with diversity. Now, I think with Dean Phillips, I'll just make the point for Joe Biden, since it's New Hampshire, we're talking about in this episode. What a great example. If anybody had a question in their mind, would I want a younger guy who basically agreed with Joe Biden on everything? And the answer is clearly no. So that issue has been settled. And the idea that, Dean Phillips has justified this campaign by saying nobody's excited about Joe Biden. It's like, well, if nobody's excited about him, then why did you lose to him in a state where he didn't campaign and wasn't even on the ballot by over 30 points? So it really shuts down the conversation. So I do think that's an interesting little nugget.
Oh, absolutely. I think there was one Democratic voter interviewed yesterday who said she was unwavering in her support for Biden, and that she found him annoying.
Follow up on that. Yes, she did say he was annoying. That was the former head of the New Hampshire Democratic Party.
Okay.
Whoever interviewed her just
yes. He didn't bother to confirm. Yes,
along with it. Exactly. Kind of funny. But an example, right, of like, I've seen all these panels of quote unquote independent voters, and it's like, oh, you actually aren't an independent voter at all. You work for this really partisan institution. So
yes, it's like
that, but
it's Chris Sununu with a fake mustache.
Yes,
it's like you didn't actually really. I don't know how independent he is. He didn't even bother with a pseudonym. Hilarious. So, and you understand kind of the political realm in the sense of strategy and when how these things work.
Sure.
So would last night have been kind of the time for Haley to, probably the best time for her to get out if she was going to get out before South Carolina, or is there an exit ramp for her, or is she just gonna
I think the world of politics has really changed, and it changed a little bit for Democrats too in that really huge 2020 primary that we had, where, and I will say, I do think the Democrats are more thoughtful about it. They're not just running for book deals and CNN contributor contracts, but that is what we've seen, right? I mean, what did Andrew Yang, who got 0 delegates, do? He got a year-long contract with CNN, and he stayed famous, and he wrote a bunch of nonsense books, and he has his podcast, and whatever. But I do think the incentive structure has really become, it's like a free press tour to run for president. There's really no downside. Like, why would she leave earlier than she had to? Because she's still getting headlines. She's still in the news. She's not going to win over the extreme MAGA base, but you have all these these ridiculous people like Jamie Dimon, who want to boost her and all that type of stuff. So it's no harm, and it only makes her more and more famous. It only makes that book deal she's going to write, more and more expensive for whoever's going to give it to her. There's really no incentive to get out. These people want to be the center of attention. They want to be in the conversation. That's what drives them. And so in this mode, sort of the longer she stays in, the more she has to gain. And she doesn't really have anything to lose. Like we were talking about, maybe Trump will disappear and vanish magically, and then she'll be in an even different position. Or, she's going to stay in until the money runs out, just as DeSantis would have. Because it's such an uncertain environment, but it's also such a media-driven environment where this is like free PR now to run for office. Think about Chris Christie, right? Like, sure, did he want to run against Donald Trump and call him out and all these things? I mean, sure, we'll give that to him. He did some little good quips. Donald Duck didn't land, but he tried it. At the end of the day, media is always going to boost what is called, at least former professor of mine, Cass Sunstein, would call this a surprising validator, but it's very basic idea of the log cabin Republicans or the Catholics for choice, right? That small percent of a larger group that's going to take the opposing position than you would expect, that's more interesting to media. So it's like when I'm on CNN, who do they have to trot out to defend Ron DeSantis's absurd slavery curriculum? Of course, it's a young black voice, because if it's some, expected white conservative voice, nobody's going to be interested or listen. They assume that maybe that's more likely. What's surprising is, did you know that we found the one guy who actually thinks this is a great idea and there were silver linings to slavery? That's more compelling to them. That's more attention grabbing. So the idea of Chris Christie, who was all on board with Trump, suddenly speaking out, that's more exciting. The idea of Nikki Haley, a woman and a minority, running and surging in the Republican primary, delusional, not really true, but it'll keep the headlines going.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, she's no moderate. I mean, even the sort of faux moderation of Susan Collins, or at least
Right.
Murkowski, there are voting records where clear, like helping save the Affordable Care Act, voting for Ketanji Brown Jackson and some other Biden judges, that they will do certain things that, like, okay, to sort of earn that cred. Haley is across the line, right? And Democrats, our big issue has been for the past, since Roe was overturned, has been abortion. That's when we've overperformed in special elections, and that's been the key issue. And she hasn't budged on it. She's clear. All she's tried to do is be forced birth, but nicer. And that is not, I've argued, someone had said this. I said, well, in a way, isn't this how Roe got overturned? Because it wasn't just that Trump, the judges, the justices he nominated, that was the most normal Republican thing Trump did, right? Like that, like if it had been Jeb or any other Republican in 2016, you would have gotten Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. They're actually, and they are the country club Republicans, right? They are the face of that superficial veneer of respectability. It's not like Trump put Marjorie Taylor Greene on the Supreme Court. It's like, oh my God, well, of course we're getting these crazy rulings. So we kind of got this from people like Haley. So there's a sense of, okay, well, Democrats need to somehow help Haley do better, because we would much rather have to run against her than Trump. And I was just thinking ruefully, it's like, well, I just hope I live to the day that any Republican has to say, well, I guess I need to strategically vote for Cori Bush or or Ilhan Omar, because the other, the Democrat who's running away with it is a literal Bond villain. It's the Joker. Well, I disagree with most of AOC's policies, but she's not a Bond villain. Like, Democrats don't seem to exist in that world. It's literally the idea of, okay, let's help someone who shares none of our values, who is destructive in these key ways, but is not a literal criminal.
That's the tell, right? Because if Jamie Dimon and all these folks wanted to hold off Donald Trump, what would be the number one most obvious thing to do? Support Joe Biden, who's a very moderate center-left president, who's restored our economy. The Dow is the highest ever, right? All of these things. You can't say it's the economy anymore, so that talking point's out the window. You can't really say he's that far left because the left is mad at him. So, he's been right down the center, just like he promised, just like he campaigned in 2020. Sure, he's a little bit old, but going for Nikki Haley, who's Donald Trump in a nicer format, is ludicrous. And I think, it's very interesting to see, you mentioned some of those people that others consider further to the left, because they are really not representative of the mainstream Democratic Party. Agree or disagree with them. It's just factually untrue that they represent a majority of our coalition. And yet the entire Democratic Party gets painted with the brush of Cori Bush. But even though the majority of Republicans are clearly in the tank for Donald Trump, clearly behind him being a rapist, clearly behind his explicit racism and sexism, all that stuff, we're not allowed to say that they're sexist or racist. It's crazy. So I think, that double standard has persisted. And I think this is the election to rip off that mask. And by the way, same thing goes for the media narratives, right? Trump always gets these absurd media narratives, and same with Haley. On abortion, they were saying she's a brilliant abortion communicator. All she said was, I will sign the most extreme psychotic law that comes to my desk as president. That is not good messaging at all. And she waffled on it back and forth 500 times. Like, how is that good messaging in any way? But somehow the bullshit narrative is that she did such an amazing job. Whereas Joe Biden had to actually, and I think this was a great move, I want to see more and more of it, is Joe Biden said, why don't you cover the economy more fairly? And they had a meltdown. The press had an absolute meltdown. They said, oh my God, let's be honest. They went from a guy that wanted them dead, that wanted to direct violence towards the free press, Donald Trump, and his press secretaries were 100% behind it. They threw a going away party for that press secretary, by the way. But when Donald Trump says, enemy of the people, they want to equate that to Joe Biden saying on this one story, the data doesn't match what you're reporting. That's crazy. That's so irresponsible and reckless. But it did work, because then you got the headlines of Joe Biden criticized the press for covering economy unfairly. And then what was the follow-up story? Americans actually now understand that the economy is doing well under Joe Biden. And I think it gets out of the trap that Hillary was caught in 2016 with the email story. It was a year plus coverage of the same story. And I think at that time there was more, not full regard for the media, but certainly more respect for the media as, a protector of democracy. And I think people don't really have that illusion anymore in 2024. And so Joe Biden should be honest when he thinks the coverage is unfair. And that's a good way to get out of it.
Absolutely. And, you working with a, pro-Biden Gen Z movement, which is important right now. And his and the issue with his age, obviously, yes, he's 80, and Haley is trying to make this the proxy battle between two old men, not mentioning that one is psychotic, but also, to put it bluntly, if we're looking at a system scenario, because it's not going to be Haley, Trump has nothing but contempt for her. So any fantasy she has for being, but if someone like Elise Stefanik,
I think it's her,
who's horrifying, and Kamala Harris, there's no comparison. Also, just in the sense of a president losing a step, and actually the concerns, because I do want to say, I've written about this. I think it's less about someone just keeling over. Right.
Sure.
And then it's more the sense that age can be cruel and the decline is not obvious or overt. Like, what do you do? And we've seen some of that with the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. But there was a sense of who would you imagine there be far more transparency about this if it were to unfortunately occur? Joe Biden, and then the transition to Kamala Harris, or Trump, if he was starting, again, it's like, even on that issue that Nikki Haley is raising, and I wish the media would challenge her on this more, which is, why would you, he's someone who doesn't listen to advisors. He's when he was told that the election was not stolen, he's someone who, why would you believe that there's any sense that this is, of the two old men, I'll choose Trump? And I think that will be the pitch, right? Like, okay, well, you're going to get all the policies you want if he'll die, and it'll be Elise Stefanik or Kristi Noem or some other, I guess, tolerable Republican.
Well, I find those people all intolerable, but
yes, tolerable in a different way, I guess. Yes, I agree.
I think that the real difference for me is that, people always ask me, do you really like Joe Biden that much? And it's like, I do think Joe Biden's been a great president, but it just matters less, I think, who is at the top of the Democratic Party, because we are not a cult of personality. Todd once said that Joe Biden doesn't have any fans. I totally disagree. He obviously has enough fans to win a contest that he's not even on the ballot. He has enough fans that, all day long, these Gen Zers that I work with are championing Joe Biden. He has all sorts of fans. He doesn't have cult members. That's the difference. And the thing is, Joe Biden is pushing forth what I feel is the logical next steps of the Democratic platform, of the progressive movement, of the issues and policies that we've been all working on and for decades and decades and decades. And so whether it's Joe Biden in that office, or it's Kamala Harris in that office, or it's Gavin Newsom in that office, or it's Pete Buttigieg in that office, I can predict that all of those folks, maybe they'll have a little bit of a different approach, but they have the same goals in mind, they have the same values, and they want to help the American people in the same ways, on education, on the economy, on equality, all the issues, climate change. Donald Trump is unpredictable. He is a cult leader. And so it's totally different, because without Donald Trump, you don't know what the Republican Party is. You don't know anything that you're getting. You cannot predict. Without Joe Biden, and I do think, by the way, it's a little bit overstated, the age narrative, for a number of reasons. But without Joe Biden, things would be pretty much the same, pretty much predictable. So I think that's the big difference to me. But I do want to talk about the age thing because, back to the point you made about Don Lemon saying that Haley was past her prime, why is she allowed to basically design her entire campaign around ageism, but somebody points out that she's also older and gets canceled for it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's
And
it's
that,
horrible.
yeah, that was
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that she's past her prime.
exactly.
But like it is a double standard yet again to the point that we made. But on age, I do want to point out, look at the Golden Bachelor. Look at these grand influencers on TikTok, which are all these older folks who have, 80 plus, 90 plus become superstar influencers. We are at a time where if my parents' generation grew up with seeing older folks excluded from society, put in homes, not involved, we have, for better and worse, we have grown up with old people running every industry into their late 80s. We've seen, all sorts of old people. By the way, health is up for a rich white guy like Joe Biden or Donald Trump. The life expectancy is incredibly high. Yes, life expectancy has gone down overall on average, but not for those people. So there's a whole, I think, difference to aging. Look at Jane Fonda, who's like, being a climate activist at 80 plus. Like, you don't see that in different decades and generations. So I do think the age conversation, there's an opportunity for the White House to really highlight just how different it is to age in 2024.
Absolutely. And yeah, just to quickly go back to the Don Lemon situation, it was so true. I mean, and you mentioned about how Haley would sort of shut down conversations that way. So specifically, her entire candidacy was rooted in ageism. One, that um, Joe Biden is senile and possibly already dead, and that we need to turn the page for a new generation, and like she's Pepsi, right? And I'm looking like, okay, well, I don't want to be the jerk. I don't want to be, like but I wouldn't say you're past your prime, but she is not your age. She's not Gen Z, right? And
You know
like
what?
even in the political realm, she's older than both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama when they won. She's older than um, Marco Rubio when he was running a similar campaign
Right.
in 2016. She's older than many powerful, voices. Obviously, as much as we loathe them in
Sure.
the House, from Marjorie Taylor Greene, Elise Stefanik, and so she was kind of basing her candidacy on,
Sure.
frankly, a lie, right? Like, and I think it was reasonable. I think Lemon was placing that in the context of, and inartfully and dumb, in a dumb manner, definitely, but in the sense of you're going after Biden, but you are, like, in political terms, not a spring chicken.
Well, and I think it's interesting. So I have a piece in the Messenger recently about how, ironically, even though that is the premise of her candidacy, she is arguably more out of touch with young voters than both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Because first of all, her campaign has absolutely failed to create digital assets. She has Nikki Haley has never gone viral on social media for the right reasons. And that's shocking. That's shocking to say about a 2024 presidential candidate. Some people may think that's silly or dismiss it. Most people are getting their news from social media, especially younger voters. Why does she not understand how to communicate with them? Then she had that gaffe about social media and forcing people to not have anonymous accounts. She just doesn't understand the moment we're in. So I say she's not past her prime, but she is past her time. And she also seems to run, and I think Republicans have really caught this too, and they're attacking her with it. She runs like she is this like old man candidate from like decades ago. Like she's like a flip-flopping, poll tested, no personality candidate, like who's gonna like give you the politically crafted answer. Whereas, and Gen Z, the one thing with Gen Z is authenticity. That's the watchword, I think, with Gen Z. And she comes off so inauthentic. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, whether you like them or not, they, I think, get credit for truly being themselves and being consistent. Whether Trump is not consistent in what he says, but consistent personality for decades and decades. They've been in the public eye or in government for decades and decades. So people know who these people are. And even when they do have a script, they go off the script. So I think that wins them points with younger voters.
Yeah, she's sort of, you can't really do a cover. Like, people get, it's like it's hard to do Psycho again when people have seen the film and get the twist, right? So she's trying to do compassionate conservatism, and like, well, no one's going to fall for that again. because we had 8 years of like, and it wasn't very compassionate. She's kind of running this 2000 campaign, as you said, very disconnected from the youth. And I would say from the energy. And it's so interesting you put it this way, because I think of like Martin Luther Green and others who have been on that, you see them on podcasts lots, even Ted
Right.
Cruz on podcast, like that sort of presence. And granted, that's where Green came from. She did not come through traditional political realms, so sort of a swamp of evil. And but Haley, yeah, hasn't. Just running a very traditional old school campaign. She's going to be make a great president of MSNBC, but not of the United States. Um, and when we talk about the youth, one criticism I've had of Democratic Party was that felt like, and I felt it's important to be aware of, because most fascist movements are fueled by young people, and there was so much of like a group like Turning Points USA that was growing in influence and strength, and really to where they weren't being condescended toward. It was like these Republican politicians were like, no, 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 you're our people, we're going to go to you, and that's your next generation. So can you talk to us about Dream for America, because I've
Sure.
seen that it's sort of being billed as sort of a progressive alternative to that movement?
It absolutely is. So we're a bit newer. We started up last year, founded by a 16-year-old. So I do think this is so interesting because I'm actually 30, so I'm the press secretary for the group, but it's led by full Gen Zers, so college kids, high schoolers. And it's interesting because I think two things. One, the early half of a generation, I find, always gets to define that generation in a really interesting way. So I'm 30, I'm the very tail end of millennials. Nobody cares what millennials think anymore. All the typecasting and, this is how millennials are, people a decade, 15 years older than me. That's who's defined the millennial generation. Same for Gen Z, kind of, as you see, the David Hoggs, who I think's done great work. So not a criticism, but, he's 6-7 years older than our founder, William He. It's a different generation, really, almost in so many ways, because of the formative moments in their lives that they've experienced. William, our founder, just wrote a piece that got a lot of traction about how January 6th radicalized him to be pro-democracy and understand that, it really is a generation that's growing up with the responsibility of defending democracy. Even my generation, we weren't thinking that way. We were like learning about it in high school, and our institutions and all this stuff. These kids are learning about it and at the same time leading in defending it. So that's a much different task. And I think, when you look at some of the prominent figures who early on became Gen Z voices, it's like 5 to 10 kids that get to define what it means to be Gen Z. There's 70 million Gen Zers out there. They're not all Ivy League super leftist kids. That's just not true. They want, jobs. They want to own homes. They want to have families. They see that for themselves in the future. So they're much more moderate than I think the headlines and the branding has been. So that's part of what our group wants to do, is have that conversation and really be moderate, progressive in the sense of what it means to achieve progress, moving the ball forward, not being, making the perfect the enemy of the good at every opportunity, which I think, has become what the word progressive has come to mean. Unfortunately, I still use it. I think it does represent still the majority of Democrats. But so that's one thing. And then, yes, it's amazing when you look at what Turning Point has done. It's really a top-down organization. By the way, Charlie Kirk is not Gen Z. He's older than me. He's like 30 plus at this point, 32 maybe. Started this organization, got $100 million of funding from the right-wing Koch network and other donors. And they target, this is how well organized they are. They target high school and college student government races and give them money so that they can win and build their resumes and disrupt and crop this talent early on of right-wing, radical, fascist, extremist young people. They have these big MAGA fest type things where they invite all these crazy people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Vivek Ramaswamy, and they have a big party and they try to get these young people indoctrinated against our democracy. And just a couple days ago, really, they launched a campaign against Martin Luther King's legacy to rewrite the history and, say these extremely racist things about him. So we exist to fight back against that because, to your point, Democrats haven't built that out as much. Now, I don't want to say they haven't built it out on purpose. I think they have a lot of organic support from young voters that we've seen really become a powerful force in recent years. So I think they've tried to lean into that in certain ways and don't feel like they need $100 million top-down organization to do it. But I think actually we've learned this from school board races, right? You have to compete everywhere. And we've seen, in the last decade, slowly this conversation is happening. I think Run for Something, which is the product of the Hillary campaign, a lot of those alumni came together to create this organization to help young people get involved in running for office. Explain to people that Republicans are so well organized at the local level that they are winning by huge numbers these school board races where sometimes the Democrats aren't even competing. And then they get to put these book bans, and then they get to, mess up all these curriculums and miseducate our children. So I think once we paid attention in 2023, there were amazing results for school board races. I think, we totally wiped out the Moms for Liberty candidates, that type of thing. But you need to compete there. So what our organization is trying to do is the same. We want chapters across the country. We have young people that have created, and I'm super proud of this, a really thorough, it's dozens of pages. It's on our website. It's called the Zoomers New Deal. It's a very detailed policy set of priorities. Joe Biden's done some of them, not all of them. But again, the reason that our group is supporting Joe Biden is because he is trying to do those things. It's not wave a magic wand and solve all the problems in the world. It's who is the candidate that is actually genuine with us and is actually working to move the ball forward for progress. And that's Joe Biden.
Well, and progressivism, I think, as you're saying, obviously is consensus and compromise. We've seen with the MAGA madhouse, these are people who can't compromise, take exceptions. They can't govern, which should always be a contrast when Nikki Haley is talking about, comparing, Kamala Harris to that dysfunction. But with true progress, I think one thing that's for young people that I'm seeing, and I totally can appreciate that, especially if you're a marginalized group member, a lot of body blows have occurred to especially queer people, people who might become pregnant, of their rights being taken under the past 4 years. Obviously, not Joe Biden's fault. He's not responsible for any of this. But it's more of the idea of presenting, the message of like, here's the progress we can make to undo what has been happening. And I think framing that in a way that is connecting with young people so they can understand in ways that they digest of like, here's what the options are, and in ways that recognize, and I'm not trying to be condescending, but I'm just speaking from my own experience. When you're in your early 20s, 5 years seems like an eternity, right? Or
Right.
10 year. Now it's like, oh, my son's 10, but when did that happen, right? Like things just change when you're a little bit older. And I think I could be someone who's like, okay, well, here's the strategy over 10 years, and it seems reasonable where if you're going to someone, especially if they're a young queer person in Ron DeSantis' Florida, and say, okay, here's a 10-year plan for you, almost, that can be tough. And so that's sort of figuring out how to, I guess, I hope it's not a dirty word.
Well, no, we can acknowledge, right? Like there's an immaturity there. It's immature. And by the way, though, I will say it's an immature mindset that sometimes is attributed to young people. But the reality is, it wasn't just young people supporting Bernie Sanders. That's not true. It was young white people in certain demographics supporting Bernie Sanders, just as we're seeing now, right? Like it's not all young people that have problems with Joe Biden. It's certain young people that may have less to lose, the way you laid it out, right? And so it's also some not young people who think that way. So, and same thing, with TikTok, we always hear a backlash about TikTok and how dare Gen Z do this or that on TikTok, and they get blamed for everything. The reality is there's 150 million Americans on TikTok. There's only 70 million Gen Zers in the country. So that math doesn't add up, right? I mean, everyone's on TikTok now. Everyone's on these social media platforms. How about instead of blaming and shaming Gen Zers and young voters for the problems of disinformation and being engaged and wanting to learn, and that's why they're jumping on these things, it's really everybody doing that at this point. Like it's your crazy Facebook uncle is not a Gen Zer who's getting misinformation about Trump and spreading it, at Thanksgiving. So why is it that we smear the young kids trying to be a part of this instead of say, well, we need to regulate social media. Well, we really need to, fix our information ecosystems. I think that's much more productive.
No, I totally agree. And I think young people with a plan and a strategy of like, here's how we can continue with progress. And that's how I define progressivism. Here's how we're advancing and being aware of what's happening. Because you're saying that sort of immature mindset, again, is playing out in the MAGA madhouse. Like these are people who can't see 5 steps ahead. They won't take victories. They won't. Like, Trump is about destroying and building. And the Politico had an article with, this is a man, a Trump supporter who had to burn it all down mentality, not a marginalized group, and he's like a middle aged man.
Who drives an
So
$80,000 truck and lives
yeah,
in a $50,000 house, and he's just mad. It's like, hey, well, we don't have time for that. Go to therapy.
that's a different mindset. From folks who don't, they see the yeah, their mentality of my family in South Carolina is like, okay, one step at a time, we're making progress, we're glad. And I think that's what you can tap into. But it's all about the communication and people feeling like they're being heard. That's all what politics
Mhm.
is. So the extent, you're this group doing that, I think is going to be vital because you've got to get
Thank
people early age. Thank you so much. We're almost at an hour. This has gone so quickly because it's been such a great conversation, and I really appreciate your taking the time, and I'm sure it's a busy schedule to chat with me about this. Where can folks find you, and what are some other things you like people to know before we
Oh, yeah, no,
head out?
thanks so much. You can find me on all socials at Kaivan Shroff, KaivanShroff. And I hope to connect with you there. And I love Wonket and I love your writing. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for like, share, subscribe, and the video version of this is going to go up on pretty much immediately, and then the podcast version will be next week. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for checking it out. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.